Okay, so as I mentioned at the end of the previous video, reflexes are very rapid, involuntary responses to some type of stimulus. And reflexes are all work part of a protective mechanism, and we'll kind of talk about what some of these are protecting against. But we can also utilize them to assess nerve function, right? So we can test reflexes to just monitor the developing nervous system. So that's used quite a bit in early childhood monitoring of the nervous system. We can use it to monitor nerves, say if someone has multiple sclerosis, so we can assess their nerves using reflexes as well. And they all have a very kind of certain path where there's some sort of a stimulus, all right, and that stimulus is going to be detected with a sensory neuron. That signal goes in, and then it often immediately comes right back out. So we often call these reflex arcs. So this reflex would be an example of a spinal reflex because it's using the spinal cord. If it's using a cranial nerve, right, that's going to go into the brain. So we have cranial reflexes if it's using cranial nerves, and we have spinal reflexes if it's using spinal nerves. So the reflex here is, say, maybe a pain stimulus, right? It looks like we're getting stung by a mosquito. Stimulates this neuron. Now, are we going to send signals up to your brain? Yes, but that's not really part of the reflex. That's just so you perceive and maybe learn the fact that mosquitoes can sting, all right? So you're going to send signals to your brain, but you're going to immediately send a signal out in order to stimulate a muscle to maybe smack that mosquito, all right? So this is kind of a typical pattern in which reflexes work. A stimulus or a sensory neuron, maybe a quick, synapse here with an integration neuron, and then a motor neuron coming right back out. Okay? We can classify reflexes a number of different ways. One way is based on how many synapses there are. So sometimes you could have a reflex that's what we call monosynaptic. So that means the sensory neuron stimulates a motor neuron directly. So there's only one connection. Polysynaptic involves interneurons. So you got to stimulate an interneuron, and then the interneuron will stimulate a motor neuron. So there's more than one synapse or more than one connection between the neurons. How they developed, some of our reflexes are innate. All right, they're kind of part of normal just development of the nervous system. And then some of them are learned. So we have a number of learned reflexes because of a lot of repetition. An example I like to give is, when you drive a car, slamming on the brake when you come to, an emergency situation is a learned reflex. Okay. Then we can use the effector as a way to classify. If the ultimate result is a skeletal muscle contraction, we call it somatic. If the result is something to do with your heart, smooth muscle, or gland, it's an autonomic reflex. So one example of an autonomic reflex might be the production of tears. So maybe you're getting, some irritation and you have a quick production of tears. Your heart, there are reflexes that cause your heart to speed up. And then finally, where the integration occurs, spinal versus cranial. So there's a number of different ways to classify reflexes. We're going to look at some examples. This first one is a stretch reflex. So what is stretching is muscle. All right. So if you think about a muscle, right, obviously we know it contracts, it relaxes, it contracts, it relaxes. Well, we've got some sensory structures inside of our muscles called muscle spindle receptors. And these muscle spindle receptors are monitoring the length of the muscle. And in particular, they get activated when the muscle gets stretched too much. Because if you think about what stretching of a muscle might lead to, is it could lead to tearing and damaging of the muscle. So when you're running, right, your muscles are constantly monitoring their length. And if a muscle starts to get too long and starts to stretch, the reflex kicks in. And these reflexes are the ones we often use to monitor someone's nervous system development. So as a child, we need to know if they're progressing, right? So there are certain benchmarks that a pediatrician knows. And one of them is using the reflexes. So they'll use their little mallet, right? And they'll tap on tendons. And when you tap on tendons, it tugs on the muscle. So the classic one here is the patellar reflex. So the patellar reflex is an example of a stretch reflex, where when you tap on that patellar ligament or tendon, it pulls on the muscle. It activates the muscle spindle because the muscle's stretched. That's going to send a signal into the spinal cord, so this is a spinal reflex, and right back out to your quadricep muscles. And that's what we're assessing, right? So if that quadricep muscle stretched, how are we going to prevent further stretching? We're going to stimulate it to contract, right? So whenever muscles stretch too much, reflexes kick in and prevent further stretching by causing the muscle to contract. Now, how do we know the muscle contracts? We get this kind of jerk of our leg. We can do this with the biceps tendon. We can do it with the triceps tendon. There's all kinds of tendons that we can tap with little mallets, cause the muscle to stretch, and that is assessing the nervous system, right? What nerve are we assessing here? We're assessing the femoral nerve, because the femoral nerve is the nerve that is transmitting the sensory signals in and then the motor neurons back out. Now, there also happens to be a reciprocal reflex, because whenever you're contracting the quadriceps, you have to also relax the hamstrings. So that's what we call reciprocal innervation. All right, so there's actually two reflexes going on here. We got the one that results in contraction of the quadricep, and then we have one that results in relaxation of the hamstring. All right, now what kind of reflexes are these? These are somatic, because the result is muscle. They're spinal, because it's using the spinal cord. The patellar reflex is monosynaptic, all right, because we've got the sensory neuron connecting directly to the motor neuron. There's only one synapse. And it's ipsilateral. Right? Ipsilateral means the same side of the body, which makes sense. When you're tapping the right patellar ligament, you get a right, knee extension. Okay? Now the reciprocal is actually polysynaptic, because we have to turn it from a stimulatory reflex to an inhibitory reflex in order to relax the hamstrings. All right, so this is an example of a stretch reflex. You got them all over your body in order to prevent muscles from stretching. And to prevent them from stretching, we cause them to contract. And we can use these to assess nerve function. Another reflex we have is known as the flexor withdrawal reflex. Flexor withdrawal reflexes are in response to pain. So in this case, we're using, the legs as an example, but you also have them in your arms. The arm ones would be if you, say, touch a hot stove, right? If you touch a hot stove, you're going to cause flexion of your elbow, which is going to withdraw your hand from that hot stove or whatever. In this case, we're stepping on something painful, and to remove the foot, we are flexing the knee. So it's a flexion of the knee that withdraws your foot from the painful stimulus. So it's a reflex arc, so you activate a sensory nerve, it goes in this case it's going into the spinal cord, so this is a spinal reflex. We're going to send a signal to whatever muscle can flex that knee. So notice if you follow this purple neuron, it's going to end up going to the hamstrings. And when you stimulate that hamstring, you're going to flex the knee. All right, so it's a protective mechanism from whatever might be painful. It's polysynaptic ipsilateral. That makes sense because if you step on something painful with your left foot, you're not going to want to remove your right foot. Doesn't make any sense. Now, there happens to be another reflex that is contralateral. So we're going to also send a signal, all right, to the other leg. And we're going to stimulate the quadricep muscle. So what would that do? That's going to help you balance. So this is called a crossed extensor reflex. So we flex to remove this foot. We extend the opposite leg in order to maintain balance. So it's polysynaptic, but the key here is it's contralateral. All right, we want to go to the opposite side in order to maintain balance. All right, so kind of interesting. If you didn't do this crossed extensor reflex, you'd probably fall over. All right, so the two reflexes are occurring simultaneously. One to withdraw your foot from the pain, the other one to balance on the opposite side. Okay, all right, so that's the end of spinal cord, spinal nerves. Let me know if you need any help. Best of luck.